right. I hope everybody's still awake after lunch. I saw some people digging in quite heavily, so I hope you don't fall asleep during my keynote address. Um, on a more serious note, though, first of all, I wanted to express my deepest sympathy and sincere condolences to those of the people here that have lost loved ones during the recent tragic events here in Sri Lanka. I have to say, I do find the resilience of the Sri Lankan people that I've spoken to so far during my time here remarkable, and I look forward to seeing the recovery and the resilience and the bounce back of this country ahead of us. I also wanted to thank the organizers, the Ceylon Chamber of Commerce, for having me and delivering a presentation to all of you. What I've been asked to speak to all of you about is on the topic of powering a green future, and specifically on how climate action can deliver both competitiveness and resilience for ports and container terminals alike. But before I do that, allow me to introduce myself and the company that I represent. Like Shiran said, my name is Tim Miltenberg. I'm the Global Head of Decarbonization for APM Terminals. And APM Terminals is a container terminal operator with a global footprint. We are 100% subsidiary of A.P. Moller Maersk, which some of you may know, the big Danish shipping line, second largest shipping line in the world. We've serviced the beautiful country of Sri Lanka for about 35 years, currently calling the country with 9 vessels. APM Terminals, like I said, has a global footprint and a minority share in South Asia gateway terminals here in the port of Colombo, so we have a footprint here as well. And beyond that, Maersk offers a range of logistics and services in the country, including custom services, trucking, warehousing, etc., etc. So that in terms of background for the company, as you can see, these are all of the places where we operate as APMT, so truly a global footprint. And that's one too far. And this is our footprint across the region here, with a highlight, of course, for South Asia gateway terminals. So before I go into how climate action drives competitiveness and resilience, I wanted to highlight, and I guess it will be familiar to many of you here, but I still think it's important to do so, highlight the importance of productive and reliable ports for economic growth and development. And I actually wanted to start with a question, so I hope someone in the audience knows the answer. Who of you know what percentage of global trade is ocean-based? Any guesses? I'm looking at my fellow panelists here. I'm assuming they know the answer. Yes, sir, in the front. 80%, very good, very good. Does anybody know, out of that, what percentage is containerized? Bit trickier. Any guesses? Pretty close. 65%, if you count by value, 65% of maritime trade is containerized. And the point that I want to stress here, right, if you look at ocean transportation, people often think of these major, massive container vessels that we see. But it's actually the ports and the container terminals that are the critical nodes, in our view, in this network that actually enable this global trade. And productivity and reliability of ports and container terminals is really crucial to drive economic development. And I can explain that with a pretty simple example, I think. If you look at a congested terminal or a congested port, what that means is economic entities in the country, for example, construction companies waiting for products to be brought in to actually assume construction of things, production companies waiting for things to be brought in. So it just hampers economic development if there's congestion in a port and if a port is not productive. And it increases the cost of trade because there will be vessels outside of port at anchorage, basically burning cash as they wait to come to the port and to make use of the services of the port and the container terminal. Now, maybe don't just take my word for it. These are some of the quotes from both the World Bank and the International Transport Forum of the OECD on the importance of productive container terminals and ports, and how unproductive ports actually are almost like a hidden tax on a country's economy. At APMT, we're pretty good, we'd like to say, in terms of running productive facilities. We have a footprint in 10 out of the 20 most productive ports and terminals in the world. And that is basically driven by our APMT business system, as we call it, which is a business system that is based on lean. And it starts with the customer at its core. We want to deliver a reliable and high quality service to customers. And then it's founded on lean principles, where it's about standardizing processes, identifying waste in those processes, and then cutting out waste in those processes to improve operational excellence. But what this really is underpinned by is actually empowered people. So everyone across the company is trained in lean practices to a pretty high level, and they are the ones, and it's not so much the people like myself in their ivory tower that sit in the headquarters, but it's really the people at the front line that are trained in lean and that are empowered to identify waste in the processes and come up with solutions actually to deliver those. So that's really one of the key pillars of what we do, is training, uplifting the workforces that we employ across the globe to help us operate ports with superior productivity. Now, I don't want to turn this into a marketing pitch for how great APM Terminals is, so it's a little bit of a segue to what I wanted to talk to you about today, and that is how climate action actually drives competitiveness and resilience. And there's 4 key takeaways that I wanted you to take away from this session. First and foremost, a good climate strategy encompasses 2 things. 1, it includes climate change mitigation, and 2, also climate change adaptation. And I'll go into a bit more detail in terms of what that means. 2, we're seeing exponential technological developments when it comes to batteries and battery electrification that is increasingly putting electrification actually in the money, making the business case pay for itself, and also opening up new pockets of opportunity for electrification. 3, we do need still a supportive regulatory framework to help drive and actually accelerate electrification and decarbonization. And 4, there's a lot of long-term planning that will be needed, both for electrification as well as for climate adaptation. So to start with the first point, if we look at how we've set up our climate strategy, it really contains 2 pillars. Like I said, 1 is climate change mitigation, which is all about how do we reduce the impact that we have as a company on the climate. So it's about understanding how much we emit and what are the levers for us to reduce those emissions. And it's about understanding the opportunities as well as the cost and benefits of that. The second pillar, climate change adaptation, is about understanding how will future climate change impact us as a port or as a container terminal, right? With climate change, we will see an increase in terms of the frequency of extreme weather events, and we will also see more severe extreme weather events. So those are the 2 critical pillars of a good climate strategy in our view. If we zoom in then on climate change mitigation, this is the commitment for us as a company, and I see some of the letters got lost a little bit, but that's okay. We have a target to be net zero by 2040, which is an industry-leading commitment. We were the first in the maritime sector, together with our parent company Maersk, to set what is called science-based targets, which is somewhat of a gold standard in terms of decarbonization targets and trajectories. But I think more interestingly, if you look at the right-hand side here, is about the levers that we have at our disposal for decarbonization. So there's 3 categories that we look at. We look at scope 1, or the emissions that occur from our operations, the assets that we own and operate in terminals and ports, where it's all about electrifying our equipment. Then you want to make sure that electricity that you consume is actually produced through renewables. So we either source renewables or we generate them directly on site. And then 3, you want to electrify and decarbonize the rest of the value chain and the ecosystem around you. So this is about making sure that trucks can charge while they're at the terminal, making sure that vessels that are alongside can actually plug into shore power so that they can shut down their engines and actually reduce emissions from vessels at berth, et cetera, et cetera. Electrifying tugboats, electrifying pilot boats, basically all of the equipment that we have in the terminal. And that is also something that we would love to do in SAGT with a concession extension. There also all of these levers would apply for all of us. As you can tell, I think electrification is a very significant driver for us for decarbonization, and I'll explain why. And this is not only just because it's the right thing to do or it's good for the climate, but there are, I would say, 3 key categories of benefits of electrification. One is the economics. Increasingly, the economics of electrification beat those of diesel or fossil fuel economics. And I'll go into a bit more detail on that later. It is actually also a good way of attracting foreign direct investment. But beyond the economics, it actually also can help with energy security. If you electrify your assets, power those with locally produced renewable electricity, of which Sri Lanka has an abundance of renewable electricity potential and already a fairly significant share of renewable electricity in its electricity mix. This basically reduces your dependence on fossil fuel imports that can be fairly volatile and can sometimes be disruptive. So it helps with energy security. And then finally, it's beneficial for workers and communities. Electric assets don't emit any harmful particulates that are detrimental to the health of both the people working in the terminal, but also the people living in and around, or living around the port and the terminal. So it's better for people's health. And if you, as we do, believe that a significant portion of future industries will be electrified, it's also about upskilling the workforce in designing, engineering, commissioning, operating, and maintaining electrical assets and infrastructure. So helping build and develop the workforce of the future. Now, on that first point of how the economics are increasingly better for electrification than they are for diesel. What you see here on the screen on the left-hand side are actually historical forecasts of the IEA. And the point that I wanted to underline, and the forecasts, by the way, are of demand for lithium-ion batteries. And the point that I wanted to underline is that us human beings are not very good at understanding the pace of technological change and adoption. We have a tendency to think linearly when it's about technological progress and technological adoption, while history has shown time and time again that adoption actually happens exponentially and through so-called S-curves. And they happen basically when new technologies reach a tipping point, which basically means as much as them becoming more affordable, more attractive, and accessible. That's what we've seen in the past with railways, electrical powers, cars, right? All the lines that you see here on the left-hand side or right-hand side. That's how historical technological adoption has gone. And that's also the trend that you're increasingly seeing for lithium-ion batteries or batteries at large. And we've seen a similar basically trend for renewables as well. And they're already much further up that sort of so-called S-curve. This is driven by ultimately cost downs and technological progress. So basically what you see here is the drop in battery cost as well as the improvements in the energy density of batteries, which is increasingly unlocking new potential and new segments of the economy and of the industry for battery electrification. And this is, of course, a pretty long-term picture, right? But the battery costs keep falling, following a so-called learning rate or Wright's law. But this is if you zoom in a little bit further, right? Because the trajectory in terms of cost down seems a bit flat towards the end. But if you look at the past 10 years, you still see a drop of about 80% in battery pack prices and battery pack costs. And this trend is what is putting electrification increasingly in the money and is also increasingly opening up new pockets for electrification. So roughly 15 years ago, when I wrote my thesis on the adoption of battery electric passenger cars. I was laughed out of the room by automotive execs in Europe. They were like, "You're crazy, battery electrification of passenger cars, never happening." Fast forward 5-10 years later, you see massive adoption of battery electric vehicles. Same thing happened with light-duty trucks, then heavy-duty trucks. In the maritime segment, you increasingly see battery electric tugs. Damen shipyards commissioned their first ones. We see battery electric ferries, battery electric barges. If this trend continues, it wouldn't surprise me if we even see in heavier duty maritime applications that we might see some battery electrification there as well. If you look at, for example, short sea shipping. Now, does that mean that it always works, electrification? Not always. We still need the right boundary conditions to be in place, because the economics look roughly something like this, right? Upfront capex for battery electric equipment is still somewhat higher than that of diesel equipment. There's a capex premium, especially if you take into account the electrical infrastructure required. But that is, in many cases, largely offset by the OpEx savings. Electric equipment is roughly 3 times as energy efficient as fossil fuel equipment, so there's energy savings. And there's a lot less moving parts in electrical assets, so there's also savings on maintenance. What is required, though, like I said, is the right boundary conditions to be in place. So we need sufficient utilization of these assets to actually recover the upfront investment premium. With assets operating in a terminal, that's not so much an issue. Cranes, trucks are pretty well utilized in productive terminals. But if you look at something like shore power, where there is not always a requirement to utilize shore power, this is really where you need policy incentives to either mandate or incentivize the use of shore power so that you can make the business case work in terms of upfront capex required. 2, there is a need to have the right spread between diesel and electricity prices. There's often times diesel and electricity prices are not just determined by the market, but there's a lot of taxes, levies, grid charges, et cetera, et cetera. And those need to be balanced if you want to be able to accelerate electrification and decarbonization. And finally, you need a sufficiently long time horizon, right? So typically, we do these types of investments on the back of concession extensions or similar type of things, because you need time to recuperate the investment and the upfront capex premium. Then last thing on electrification, and then I'll skip to climate change adaptation. What this also means, this improvement in the business case and increasing electrification of different segments, is there will be a lot of additional power demand coming from ports and container terminals. So we need to start planning today for what that future looks like. To give you a very rough idea, purely talking about container terminal operations, power demand is going to double if you electrify a typical container terminal of today. If you then add shore power, that's another doubling. So you're quickly going to run into a situation where your power demand, especially if other segments around the port also electrify, is going to double, triple, quadruple, et cetera, et cetera. So you really need to start planning for that now to make sure that you have the power capacity required in the future. Batteries do help us out a little bit here, especially the fact that they are becoming cheaper and have higher energy density. What we're doing increasingly in our terminals across the world is deploying batteries that charge during periods of low power demand so that they can be discharged during periods of high power demand. And that allows you to reduce the peak power and therefore reduce to some extent the infrastructure investments required. Good, then on to climate change adaptation. So there's, of course, a lot of effort being put into accelerating climate change mitigation and decarbonization by stakeholders across the world. But the reality is that we do see climate change, and we will see continued change in the climate and continued increase in global temperature levels. So we need to also understand how that impacts us as a company and what adaptation measures we can take to ensure that we have robust and resilient port infrastructure. This is a snapshot actually of SAGT and of some of the future exposures that they might have under one specific climate scenario. Luckily, SAGT, as we also saw with the recent cyclone, has pretty good emergency response systems in place, has pretty resilient and robust infrastructure. But still, it is critical to understand what this will look like in the future. To give one very concrete example that I think is easy to understand and also illustrates how we do this, we want to understand how hazards are going to change in the future. So let's take, for example, increases in sea level rise and storm surges. So you want to understand, and that's the hazard forecast and exposure analysis, you want to understand how sea level will rise and how storm surges will change under different future climate scenarios. Once you know that, you want to do an assessment of your infrastructure in terms of how vulnerable it is. So you want to understand what the height is, of course, of your quay wall and whether that's sufficiently adapted to rising sea levels or storm surges. And if it's not, you want to basically implement adaptation measures, such as heightening the quay walls. Then maybe one snapshot of how that all comes together for us as APMT. In the Port of Elizabeth in New York and New Jersey, on the back of a concession extension, we're currently investing in electrifying the entire container terminal. We're also implementing shore power. And on the back of this assessment of the climate risks that this terminal faces, we're heightening the quay wall and the entire yard by 1 meter. And that is sometimes the types of investments needed to ensure that ports and terminals are actually resilient against future scenarios of climate change. I'll start wrapping up. What I want you to take away from this is that this is increasingly for us becoming the new normal in greenfield terminals, brownfield terminals, small and large, and in developing or more developed countries alike. We electrify and we plan for the adaptation to climate of all of our critical infrastructure. So again, wrapping up in terms of key takeaways, good climate strategy considers both climate change mitigation and adaptation. Electrification and the exponential technological developments are increasingly putting this in the money. We do still need supportive regulatory frameworks, especially for things like shore power. And we really need to start long-term planning today for both the grid infrastructure required and the future scenarios of climate change to ensure that the infrastructure of the ports and terminals is resilient. Thank you very much.